Hello there, I'm Paul Cargan here with Torgny Roxå to discuss an article he's written that I've quite appreciated. Torgny is an associate professor of engineering education at Lund University in Sweden. Has worked for many years as a faculty developer and researcher, and has co-authored, if I'm getting this correctly, over 100 papers, authored and co-authored over 100 papers, including this recent essay. So thank you for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you.
I want to ask you some questions about your essay. As you can see, I've marked it thoroughly. Your essay has just come out in Teaching and Learning Inquiry. It's making use of educational research in higher education. But I also want to ask you some questions about the bigger conversation. In the article you mentioned this is part of a bigger conversation, so I want to talk about that too. So I want to start with you. What led you into engineering education versus engineering, and to using research on teaching in your own teaching?
Yeah, so it dates back to the 80s, actually. I had a degree in literature sociology, and I couldn't find a decent job with that kind of education. So I was recruited into staff development. I was active in our student union full-time, and that's where the people found me. Back then, when we did, well, what we do is that we run pedagogical courses for teachers. It's a tradition since beginning of the 90s. And I was doing that, but it was basically tips and tricks back then. So it was mostly about how can you do things in lectures and what can you do here and there. It took me into problem-based learning because our School of Dentistry was sort of transforming curriculum into problem-based learning. And problem-based learning has a long tradition of researching everything they do. So I found a lot of literature in that and was inspired to bring that into higher education, where I also, by the time of late 90s, found the concept of scholarship of teaching and learning. So we adopted that here as a strategy for change, organizational change, or to be more specific, changing the culture of our organization, higher education organizations. So I started to ask my teachers going through my courses that I have to do a project and to write it up using some references from education, since they all know that theories are good, both for directing perception, but also for interpreting results. And it turned out to be quite easy to get them to do that. By the time I was doing this, I also got more and more to do in engineering. Those are national reasons. The Swedish government, just going to take something out there. The Swedish government have just sort of supplied money for pedagogical training of professors, and it could only be used for that purpose. So the Faculty of Engineering wanted me to do that, and everybody liked it, and they basically fell in love with education or pedagogy. So from that on, we intensified the use of scholarship of teaching and learning. We introduced a reward system for excellence in teaching based on scholarship of teaching and learning, which gives a title and raises salary and to those who are being rewarded. We also managed to move money between departments. So if you work in a department, you're rewarded, your department get extra funding. Which is taken from the other departments, since there are no other money. And we've been doing that since 2001. After some years in this, around 2005-06, me and my colleague Katarina, we write a lot together. We started to sort of run into the borders of what was around in higher education research. We wanted to change the institution, but there were not so much literature on that, and that's where we started to do our own research. We went in a direction where we think that teachers, academic teachers, are individuals, but they're also entangled in collegial networks. It turned out that we asked academic teachers with whom do you talk about teaching and learning in a serious way? And it turned out that they have basically 4 ± 2 people to talk to. Some of them are in their own working sort of closely with them. Others are in the university, or they could be people outside the university. They could be spouses, so they could be friendship relations or whatever, but they all had someone to talk to. And we thought that in these conversations, that's where you try out your ideas about teaching and learning. So we call those significant relationships, and we built an idea that if you want to change teaching and learning, those relationships is what you should target rather than the individual teachers. If you can get them to talk differently to each other and do that in these networks, these significant networks, we call them. What significant, because that comes from social psychology. If a person is significant to you, basically, if a person is significant to you, you allow that person to influence yourself. And we all have those relationships in different domains in our lives. So my wife, I allow her to influence me quite a lot because she is significant to me. There are other people who are out there and they influence me a little bit, but not that much because they are less significant to me. So if you can get into the significant networks dealing with teaching and learning and change those interactions, you would change the entire system. And we found that scholarship teaching and learning is foremost a way of changing the conversational culture. To give you an example, a setting that happened in one of our departments was that a quite famous professor was discussing with his doctoral students how to teach a certain subject within their domain. And he argued, because they were talking about the examination, the final assessment. And he argued that, we should do this in 4 hours in a room without any aid, just a piece of paper and a pen, because that's how we always done it, and it had worked out really well. And they argued that this is a totally unauthentic way of doing it because it will never happen in the future. It's just a strange way of testing a capacity that will not be used. So they wanted other kinds of examinations, and they were going about this for about 20 minutes. And then one of the doctoral students asked this professor, so his name is Peter. So she said to him that, well, Peter, we have argued this now, and we have given you our references that backs up our position, so that we know literature. We mentioned that for you. Where are your references? And this is a very interesting and good professor. So he said, I think we should continue this conversation in a couple of weeks' time, which they did. And he had then found references, research arguing that the best way to exam students is to have a 4-hour exam in the end of the course. So in a way, you might say that they haven't changed position at all. They were just in the same place. But the nature of the conversation has changed. From that on, it was not enough to just have an opinion about teaching. So you can go from an opinion-based conversation to a reference-based, or as we do in academia, because that's how we're supposed to talk about things. And they continue to do that. So what we're looking for here are very, very tiny changes in each interaction. And if you sum them up, you get a huge change in an academic community. Because they will, if you change them a little bit, it's like DNA. It's like inserting a piece of DNA in a molecule. That piece of DNA will now create new stuff every time you talk to that person. And that's what we're trying to do. So using references in this is a way of sort of saying that you're academics, that's what we do. We use that. And we do. That's the history.
You have said a lot that I love just now and want to come back to. So you have this whole time then in the decades that you've just narrated been working, I guess, with the same department, the same community And am I getting that correct?
Yeah, I worked with faculty for engineering in our university for 25 years. It's a place with about 9,000 undergraduate students and about 600, 650 sort of senior academics, and the same number of doctoral students. And these doctoral students all teach 20% of their time. So it's about 1,200 teachers altogether. And that's the context I've been working with for 25 years, yes.
So you have been, I mean, that's kind of a lab in a sense on how the net works. You've had those same networks that you've been developing and participating in.
In a way, yeah.
I think you kind of gave an example of this already with the changing of the conversation. But if a teacher were to, or if you have in your teaching, were to implement some findings from research, what would that look like? What can you give me an example of some changes that have happened that you've seen or that you've done?
Yeah, we had a guest from University of Michigan this week, a professor in material sciences. And she is also interested in doing research on how to use virtual reality to enhance students' understanding of certain concepts, threshold concepts and that. And she told us, I wasn't there when this happened, but she told me that she was giving a seminar about this in the physics department. And she was amazed because she asked them at a certain stage in this sort of, so I'm using Bloom's taxonomy. Have you heard about Bloom's taxonomy? And they all raised their hands because to them it was sort of quite natural. And someone said to her, yeah, Bloom's taxonomy is really good, but usually we use the solid taxonomy because we think that is a much better taxonomy. And to them, that just came natural. It's sort of a thing about their everyday conversation. They don't even think about it anymore. It's just what they do. What could be, I suppose we will run in at that later, but we can introduce that already here. I think a fair question is that if you as a person like me then, or a manager or someone who's interested, a stakeholder or whatever, think that we would like to improve teaching in higher education by the use of educational research. And that makes fair. That's not a very unique aspiration. But the question would be, how much educational research is needed for an academic teacher to improve teaching? I mean, a quantity. Would it be a linear development? So the more education you know, the better teaching there is. And I think that is obvious to most people. That is not true. And I would say probably you don't need a lot at all. You need sort of a handful of concepts and perspectives, because developing university teaching takes a long time. I've read portfolios that we have that describe this person works with a pedagogue with a course in economy for civil engineers, and she uses 5 years to develop that course before she's happy with it and finds sort of the correct evidence that she thinks, yeah, now it works. This is what I'm going to do. So just pouring concepts on these people will not work at all. I mean, that's useless. So what do you do then if you think that there are tons of concepts and perspectives around from education? So what should I tell them? Well, the best way to do it is to get them to ask for it, because then they decide what sort of kind of concept they need of. So how do you do that? Well, you ask them to tell you about your teaching, and after a while, when you listen to them, you realize that things are problematic for them. I mean, all academic teachers have some kind of problems they're working on. So there will be something saying that I want the students to do this, right? But I've tried this and this and this, but it doesn't really work. So one popular one is feedback. So, students hand in these assignments and I write feedback on it. I use quite a lot of time to do that, but the students do not seem to pay attention. It's like sort of throwing it in there and I can't see any effect from it and what's going on. And that is a global issue for academic teachers. So I would suggest sort of a couple of sort of articles about that problem to them. And then I would also say that have you tried peer feedback? They can give feedback to each other in organized settings. If you provide them with criteria, they will probably be able to provide good feedback to each other, and also sort of enjoy the learning of trying to understand what someone else wrote. And they say, yeah, that sounds interesting. And if you want to know more, I say, you can read Anna Axelsson. She's a lecturer in computer science. You can read her articles about it, because she has scholarship of teaching and learning articles about that. So you can read them and see what she did. And if you like that, you can talk to her and have lunch with her. She's just sort of in another building here at the campus. And they do, actually. They do that. Because Anna Axelsson is also she's a regular teacher in this faculty, and the text she wrote is how she compared. Students write a lot of code in computer science, and traditionally the teacher is supposed to give feedback on that code, and she organized peer feedback sessions. But to figure out whether it works or not, she was actually she was sort of collecting the feedback students were giving each other, and then without having looked at that, she gave feedback on her own on these pieces of code, and then compared her feedback with their feedback, and they're not 100% match, but for learning purposes it's quite good. So now she's organizing feedback sessions for 80 students, and it takes her 2 hours, and all students get feedback and all students give feedback, and it works. And I mean, that's a brilliant way of doing it, and it solves other teachers' problems, and it's a good teaching experience, a learning experience. But to us, it's basically inducing a new element in the way they talk to each other.
Yeah, you had suggested just a handful of concepts is enough.
Yeah.
And so I was going to ask, well, what concepts, what handful would
do we teach them?
but it sounds like what you're saying is that's not the point. The point is to change the processes so that.
Yeah.
And change the conversation so that teachers are going to look for their own handful.
But of course, we provide them with a handful of concepts, because we run these pedagogical courses, and we think that certain concepts are the ones that we should use. And what we use is I don't know if you're familiar with this on the other side of the Atlantic, but there is something called constructive alignment. Do you know about that?
So refresh me.
Yeah. Constructive alignment is a way of thinking about academic courses, and it's done by John Biggs, and it's also formed the backbone of the Bologna process, which is a big thing in Europe, where we tried sort of to similarize higher education systems nationally in a European version of it, and constructive alignment is the backbone of that. And basically what it is, that when you design a course, you should start thinking about not what you should teach them, about what are they supposed to be able to do after the course. So you think in very functional terms. I have these students here for this number of weeks or this hours or whatever I have, and I should think about what do they need to be able to do after this course. And after thought about that, I should start. The next phase is to design the examination strategy. How could I check that they actually learned this and develop these skills? And after that, you start to think about what content and what teaching and learning activities should I run them through so that they achieve this. So it's sort of a backward way of doing it, but it's also a way of getting everything in order, right? And the most important thing in teaching is what they do after this. It's not what I do, but what they can do. So we teach them about that. We also teach them about Bloom's and Solo taxonomy. We teach them about something called deep and surface approach to learning. Deep approach to learning is when students are studying because they want to understand the stuff, right? And surface approach to learning is basically when they study in order to memorize things for the exam. And these two things are very powerful, because teachers sort of naturally understand this, and they recognize students doing the one or the other. So if we teach them these two concepts, they get a quite sort of efficient language of talking about what is a better course than another course. Well, if this course supports more deep approach to learning, it's a better course. And there are literature around that. We also designed our student evaluations of teaching around that concept. So they know if they get good on the student evaluations of teaching, they probably have a course that creates a lot of deep approach to learning. So those basically those are concepts that we always teach them. Then there are some others that might come up or others that might not. So
I love how you begin your essay. So you say you contrast the world of education with the world of medicine. I'm just going to read a couple sentences. When I'm ill and seek medical advice, I expect that the doctor is up to date with the research in the relevant field. I want to be treated according to the latest evidence. When I am being taught, however, this is not something I can expect. I really think that is a very telling and powerful analogy. I wonder if you might want to elaborate on that.
Yeah. Well, there are two branches of that. The first one, and most sort of the one that I experienced, was that I was sitting in a conversation, actually in North America, where people started to think about maybe we need some kind of translational research in education. The assumption was that maybe education research is too complicated for academic teachers to learn from or to read. And I intuitively thought that this is actually rubbish. And that's actually the starting point for the research that I present in this article. But in medicine, they do that because if you're in biomolecular sort of science somewhere and you find a molecule that you have to treat a certain disease, these are complicated stuff. You know, you have to be a chemist and you have to be everything. And medical doctors are many, many things. So, of course, what they try to do is to make this pathway more efficient that's the lab to clinic sort of way of thinking. We have to move the language quickly from the lab to the clinic. So I wanted to test whether academic teachers could actually, some empirical data on can they read this stuff? And as I show in the article, they can, partly because I instruct them to do so. And when I instructed them to do that, these, in the article, for those who haven't sort of read it, these people are doctoral students in engineering, different branches of engineering. And most of them have no training in psychology or sociology or education or anything. This is their first experience in this field. But when I instruct them to go find research in sort of somewhere that backs your claims up, they do that. And not only that they do what I sort of instruct them to, but there is also a variation in how well they do it. And I interpret that as a variation coming out from how meaningful they find this research to be. But even though some of them use very little research, they do it. So it means that they are capable of doing it. Some of them use more, and that's because they find it meaningful. So if we want it to happen more, I would say it's about how meaningful it is, not about their capacity to actually read this stuff. The other one is education is a very different place than medicine. Because, if you have one body and you have a molecule and you know that if you give this kind of drug, the molecule will react like this and the body will react like this. It's pretty possible to actually decide that from the beginning, that this is what's going to happen. And then you can do double-blind studies and all that kind of stuff. If you change sort of the classroom with 30 students going out and new 30 students coming in, it's a totally different situation. And you have basically that these students will probably react in this and this way. But if we talk about fine-grained qualities like good learning or not so good learning, or understanding these concepts or not these concepts, it's really hard to predict that based on the method that we use. You have to go much closer to figure out whether it works or not, because the situation has uniqueness around it, which is not the thing when you treat different kinds of cancer or migraine or stuff like that. Even though the usual people like you and me, we try to think about the medical doctors as they would be interested in us as unique experiences too, because we are, we have our life history. That seems to come in the background. And of course, when I go to the doctor because I have, it could be anything wrong with me, maybe it's something with my heart, I'm probably more interested in, can you help me to get my heart right, than could you listen to my entire story? Even though I want to be treated with respect, it doesn't mean that I come across as a unique person. I want them to look at the heart or give me something. So I think medicine and education are two very different places. But mostly what I wanted to do was to prove that there is no problem for them to find and read this stuff if we get them to do it. So translation research in higher education is just from education into classrooms. I can't see any point in that.
I wonder if you have some ideas on why teachers don't already, like why is it not already the norm?
Yeah, they are academics, aren't they? They are trained in being rational in thinking, and yeah, I think that has more to do with how we are as people. One fact with our mind and how we interact with the world is that there is no stability. You know, if you think about how you can dream anything, which we occasionally also do. And it means that in the world, if you look around you, you can actually interpret the world in any way. And if you look into history or political history or any kind of history, you find that humans create the most strange ways to live together. And that goes together with academic teachers too, because they are people. So if you look at an academic in my faculty, you have pockets of academics people inventing and sustaining the most, I would say, strange beliefs about students. And they maintain these because they need some kind of stability in their environment, as we all do. But they happen to come into, in bad cases, into interpretations of the world, including students, as is almost negative and harmful to students. But they maintain that because that's what the world looks like. So if you're in that situation, why would you read any articles that would sort of counteract or be a counter argument to the way you understand things? Because if you do and tell the others, they would just say, oh, they're rubbish. We don't care about that. This is how people act. You know, it's not academic teachers. This is how humans do it. So my job is to get things into those. And I realize that it's not me, it's colleagues doing that. Academic colleagues will tell other academic colleagues that there might be something problem. There is a problem with how you talk about students. And when that happens, that's when magic happens. It's not the research, it's because it's another person that I identify with myself with and I respect. And when that person is saying something to me, I might be prepared to reconsider some stuff. If we then could get these microcultures, as we call them, these archipelago of different worldviews that are in place in my faculty, if we can get them to be interested in higher education research, they will find that because it will be part of how they view the world. So my job is to sort of fuel that. And if I get into the state when they start to look for information themselves, I'm pretty much done, you know. They don't need me anymore.
I'm wondering if one, and perhaps related to that situation you're describing, where people naturally don't want to be contradicted. So on page 68 here, you say to make these results, meaning the results of literature or research on teaching, a living and debated part of university teachers' everyday conversations and thinking would most likely be a good thing. Yeah. And I really like that phrase, a living and debated part, because I'm wondering if one hesitation that teachers have is this sense, some researcher is going to tell me how to teach, but the research says one thing one day, it says the next thing another day. They don't know my students, so nobody's going to tell me how to teach. And that's not what you're saying. Is you're not saying go in and kind of slavishly follow what the research says. You're saying use it, make it part of this conversation, this debate. And I really like that.
But there is a important thing, I think, with how we phrase these things. Because as I said to, or try to say in the article as well, when these academic teachers feel the need for it, they go and find this material. And if the material they find is helpful for them, then they will consider that to be a good strategy, and they are likely to do it again, right? So there is no chance, there is no chance in hell that I can find any research argument that convince them from the beginning that is really good. I mean, if they're not looking for that argument, they can slice anything to pieces. It doesn't matter where it's published or who did it, because that is part of our profession. We can just tear any research apart. But if the material comes in a situation where I'm imbalanced, or I have a problem, or I'm in a dissonant state, and I realize that this research actually helped me to sort of develop or do what I wanted to happen, then I will go back for more, because that's how people work.
So you, as a good researcher, qualify your findings in this study. You found that these doctoral engineering students could find and translate research on their own, but then you have a number of big ifs. And the first one is if they're instructed to, and if they're in this course. And then you also add the caveat that you don't know, based on this study, whether they're going to go use it in their teaching. And then you pull in what you've just been talking about now, that what determines whether or not they will is other factors other than whether they understand it. You've just been talking about now if they have a need, and you talk about these micro communities, and that you use a couple phrases for that here that I like, or micro cultures, and local teaching and learning regimes, and kind of the collegial context. So it's not the teacher and the literature. It's the teacher and the literature and their fellow teachers that determine whether it's gonna click. So how do you have some advice on how to foster those microcultures, teaching and learning regimes that value making this literature part of the conversation?
Yeah, we've written quite a lot about that. So there are many articles talking about how to do this. Since we are developers, we try to make it clear that, help people to actually do it. Well, first of all, you need to, I think the pedagogical courses we use, or you could do that in many cases, and it's done in North America too. You run people through workshops and stuff. You need to provide them with useful intellectual tools. That's basic, and I just gave you a handful of things that we do provide them with. But then you have to provide an arena for them to meet others. Because I can give you an example. We have teaching and learning conferences, so campus conferences. There's also a university-wide conference about teaching and learning. And Anna Axelsson and Roy Anderson, who is doing the peer review thing, peer assessment thing in computer science, in one of these conferences, suddenly we're sitting listening to a guy teaching Chinese, who also tried to use peer feedback in his teaching. And they had a long conversation after that. They sit for half an hour or something talking about exchanging experiences and so on. And these are the meeting places that we have to organize. So you meet the other person doing the right thing, not that you have to talk to someone who described that to someone who described that to someone, because that will be what I think you call in English is Chinese whisper game. Things will change. It's what you do with kids, when you are small kids in a party, you have them to tell things to each other, and the whole meaning changes. Then you need some kind of artifacts. An interesting thing with academics is that when you put things in writing, they mean something else than if you say them. Well, it's like when you write stuff and put your name on it, it's for real. That was what counts. So we put a lot of emphasis in getting our teachers to write about their teaching and learning experiences. Basically, in engineering, we use a concept of 1,300 words times 10 points and 2 columns, very dense, very short, because that's what engineers do. That's how they write. And when that concept was transported into humanities, they can't have 1,300 words. I mean, when you start your computer, there are 1,300 words coming out immediately. So you need 4,000, right? And they also have double spacing, and they have flowers on the cover. But that's just cultural artifacts. You know? Basically, what they do is writing to each other. So in engineering, we collected these artifacts, and we now have a database of 600 of these written stuff that we can direct teachers into that database and say, go have a look what your colleagues did already. And when we do that, we present new teachers with a ready-made reality. In our faculty, you write about your teaching. Look here, your colleagues have done it, and you can go in and have a look. So now in my faculty, it's totally natural to write about your teaching. And in this short, small scholarship of teaching and learning ways. It's not research what they do, but it's a systematized reflection on teaching based on some concepts and some kind of systematic observations of student learning. And we know that these written artifacts have improved in quality over time. We looked at that. So there is more focus on student learning. There are more concepts from education. There are more systematic observations. They are more coherently written. So they're basically better now than they were 10 years ago. It's a sign of improved quality in conversation.
So it sounds like you have really developed something unique in that department. I don't think this culture where it's that natural is very common. And is that your impression as well?
Well, I think it's unique in its sort of elaborated way. There are others trying to do similar things. In Scandinavia, there are sort of more of it than other places, perhaps, because we think sort of in similar ways, I guess, and you know that's where it spreads first. So the reward system that we developed in 2001 has spread to 29 other places in Scandinavia. Almost everyone has a campus conference nowadays, and that's true for large parts of the world. If I go to North America, I'm struck with the fact that it seems to be that most of my colleagues in North America still thinks that they should develop university teaching by focusing on individual academics. So this idea of them being linked to each other in networks haven't really rooted itself in North America. So to me, if I'm ironic and sort of be drastic in my formulation, they still live in the mythical world that academia consists of individuals. Which, of course, those individuals who are very successful, they like to support that view, because if I'm a senior professor somewhere, I want to sort of tell others the narrative that I'm so bright and clever, so I took me into this place. But actually, we're all interlinked with each other in sort of intricate networks, and we're all dependent on each other. And academics might be that even more than others. Some ethnologists in my university wrote an essay where they said that we live in an assessment culture. You know, you are being assessed as an individual from your first day at university as a student to the day you die. Or even, they say, after you're dead, because when you're dead, there are colleagues writing up these, what do you call it, obituaries. And you can see other older professors sitting reading those in the morning coffee and say, oh, no, he wasn't that good. You know, we know that he didn't do this. So we are crucially dependent on other people as academics, especially our colleagues. And I think it's really, really productive to recognize that.
So the page in your article that I have most thoroughly marked, as you can see,
wow,
you really drive home this idea that people will use the research if it's meaningful. And what I'm hearing here is from you now is it's meaningful when it's part of these conversations, it's part of this community, part of this culture. So is that if we were to boil down the takeaway is that a teacher will use the research when the teachers they're teaching with value it and work it into their conversations.
That's a large part. If you arrive as a new teacher to a context like that, you just have to start doing that. If I want to play with these people, I have to behave according to the rules that already exist when I arrive there. I think they grow, they start not because, I mean, you have to develop into this. And I think the key point there is that you will turn to educational research if you find that that particular research helps you in your own thinking. It releases attention somewhere. Because academics are in some kind of academic culture would be a learning culture. It's the ethos is to learn new stuff. Situations have put us in a situation where we do that in research, but not so much in teaching. And it's very natural because in research you build your career, you get money, you get doctoral students, you get a name. If you improve your teaching 5%, the students are happier, and then nothing else. Mm-hmm. But if we can get that momentum into teaching and learning, they will use it too in order to learn, because that's the ethos of the culture. But if you give them concepts which to them are considered, or they assess, but they look at them and find them to be irrelevant, so why would they? Why would they use them? But if they are relevant, they will just incorporate that like nothing into their own thinking. That's my experience anyway, and that's what people do.
I have been so helped and inspired by this conversation. Thank you so much for talking with me. Those are my questions that I have for you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so. I know it works. I could give you numbers that, we have numbers showing that it works, but I don't have to bring that up here. But I can tell that it does work. We have sort of big numbers showing that change is happening. But that's another story. But no, maybe there are limitations with this. So the problems we have, we're really good at activating academic teachers. They become interested, they write this stuff, they read this stuff. But we still have problems, in my case, with curriculum development. So we teach 5-year-long programs. And to coordinate these 5-year-long programs is still a challenge for us. It might be that the approach we use, where we based on evidence, do activate teachers and they become better teachers, it doesn't seem to come natural that they also start to coordinate themselves. And that's the problem we're still working on. So I sort of intuitively think that our approach has a limitation there. Maybe we need to think differently to achieve that. And that's the challenge we're working on.
So there's a difference between, we had this great conversation and I'm inspired, I'm going to go back and make changes in my classroom, versus we're going to collaborate on the curriculum and make changes together right now.
Yeah. I need to do this because 2 years later they will encounter something, and that's why I need to do this now. That is beyond my personal experience, and therefore maybe also my personal sort of sense of meaning. So yeah, that's a tough one for us right now. We work on that, but we haven't solved it yet.
I look forward to what you learn.
Me too.
as you work on that.
Yeah, me too.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm feeling enriched, and I want to go and connect more with my colleagues and have more of these kinds of conversations that you're talking about.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to cut off our recording here.